hope everybody else shows up.
Better.
We got Paul and Warner incognito.
Alright, so I'm starting this now. It's the pits.
Welcome, James. You are muted, sir.
Good evening.
There we go. We have Paul and
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the GPC meeting, the one only for November 2020. And start off with the introductions of members and guests. Dan Saunders, Chair.
Jeff Fitzgerald, Vice Chair.
Janet Powell?
Secretary.
I guess so.
Paul Hogan.
James McMahon.
Tom Morgan.
Liz Durfee, I'm a planning consultant.
Thank you all. Sorry, I was a bit. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there.
Warner Gilliam.
Mike Corsi.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining. Apologize for being a little bit late here. We'll start off with our agenda item.
Dan, I think you're having Wi-Fi issues. You're pretty choppy, both video and audio, and everybody else seems okay. You're in fact frozen right now, and I can't hear you.
I must admit, it's a good pose there, Dan.
About to put Jim in as quarterback.
Good profile, strong chin. Yep, he's out. Jim, why don't you grab the ball and run with it, and maybe Dan will be able to rejoin us. You're muted, Jim.
Our second item on our agenda is to review the Water Resources Chapter, draft number 1. And I can't remember how we kind of get into that, but Tom or Liz, you kind of start us off.
Sure thing. Would it be possible to give me the ability to share my screen?
Yeah, just a sec.
Thank you. And then I'll get started. I'll pull up some slides. And all right, so do you see my PowerPoint slides here?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try again here. Okay, here we go.
There we go.
How about now?
There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
And
Good.
let me see. Okay, how's that? Good? Full screen?
Better.
Great. All right, well, thanks for having us at the GPC meeting tonight. We're going to go over the Water Resources chapter, tentatively labeled Chapter 8. The chapter numbers are in flux a little bit. And we sent out the chapter last week. Hopefully everyone had a chance to take a quick peek at it. But I'd be happy to scroll through sections if folks didn't have a chance. Feel free to interrupt during the presentation. I might not be able to see you all the time, so just give a shout out if you have a question or you want to stop and talk about something, and we'll go from there. So this chapter contains an inventory and discussion of the freshwater resources, rivers and streams, aquatic habitat, wetlands, drinking water resources, and floodplains. Tom is going to cover the marine resources chapter, I believe at the next meeting. So we won't get into some of the coastal and tidal river resources tonight. One of the criteria to include in this chapter is a summary of threats to water quality and water resources. So I'll go over some of those threats and then some of the existing protection measures. So here is a map of the different subwatersheds in Kennebunkport. They fall within two main groups. If you can see my mouse here, everything sort of on the west side of town in this bright green and pink area is part of the Kennebunk River watershed, and everything else is part of what's called the coastal drainage, and essentially empties out into some of the tidal rivers or directly into, from streams directly into the ocean. The two main water bodies are the Batson River and the Kennebunk River. And there are some very small dark red areas that you can see on this map, and those are ponds. There are no designated great ponds, which are surface water bodies with greater than 10 acres of freshwater, and there are no large lakes. Essentially, most of the ponds are usable for fishing, but not necessarily swimming or boating. Here is another map that shows some of the key aquatic habitats. I've shown significant vernal pools and wild brook trout habitat. This is from the Division of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, beginning with habitat assessment. So these are some of the habitats that are identified as critical or valuable. I've also shown in this sort of light purplish gray, the palustrine wetlands, which are the most prevalent type of wetlands in Kennebunkport. And in green, there's a patch of what's called a high value plant polygon. That's how it's mapped out. It's a non-tidal, non-forested wetland, and you can consider it like a rare habitat. Wetlands account for approximately 25% of the area of town, and the palustrine wetlands account for just over half of these wetlands. And I've included the acreage here of the different types of wetlands. And palustrine wetlands are, they're non-tidal, they have very low salinity due to ocean-derived salts, and they're dominated by vegetation including trees, shrubs, persistent emergence, which are plants that are generally rooted on the ground, but surface about 4 or 5 feet above. They reach the surface of the water about 4 or 5 feet above the wetland floor. And wetlands identified as open water comprise about 54 acres of the community.
Hey, Liz,
Yes.
just a quick question back on the map that showed the rivers. Werner, you probably know the answer. The narrative on the Batson describes it as flowing into a location between Goose Rocks and Marshall's Point, which is what my understanding has always been. But where you label the Batson doesn't seem to connect to that river.
Yeah.
So Werner, are there 2 Batson rivers? Or are they, you see how it goes up by Route 9 and then it?
Yeah. Yeah, well, and what's, I guess one of the questions that I have would be, what was the line data source, for the rivers and streams? Because it does look like there's maybe a little bit of a disconnect on the Batson there.
Yeah, I can double check it. It's most of the data that we're using is from the state.
Yeah.
But I can double check why that's not showing clearly there.
Yeah, because right where that, course,
map.
I'm sitting here with my mouse, showing where the area is. Of course, you can't see that, but but yeah, I think where we're looking at, there's where Beechwood where Beechwood
Mhm.
Avenue
Mhm.
connects where you have Beechwood come across to Route 9. Yeah, it looks like there's a chunk that's missing there.
I can double check
Right.
that.
We
It's
also
not
have,
routed underground, is it there?
no,
Okay.
no.
Tough sledding for canoeists, huh?
Yeah, and so we can take a look at that. It may be that the hydrology that we use on the GIS maps might be a little bit more accurate for what we have here in town.
Do you know what data source you usually use?
I want to say we kind of tweaked and developed our own hydrography layer, back whenever it was initially, when we were first building the GIS, to begin with. So, I mean, we used a combination of state data, but I know there were some issues with some of the, like some of the USGS stuff.
Yeah.
Wasn't super accurate.
Okay.
I had a question on this, since we're back on this map here. There's that looks like a pink watershed area that's in, kind of close to the downtown area.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I see where the Kennebunk River watershed is labeled. I'm not sure what that pink watershed is, but that area, certainly drains to the Kennebunk.
Yeah, I couldn't find the actual names for those smaller drainages, but the pink and the green are both part of the Kennebunk River drainage. I
Okay.
didn't label the drainages. I just labeled some of the surface water bodies. So everything that's listed under coastal drainage up here, which is essentially all of the sub watersheds except for the bright green and the pink are part of the coastal drainage. So most of the town. And then I think it's about 5, well, I'll have to double check the numbers, but this portion all drains into the Kennebunk River.
Yeah, I think those two could probably be combined. Looking at the topography for that area, I mean, it all pretty clearly goes into the Kennebunk. So those, as opposed to trying to figure out some other labeling for it, I think those two could be, combined together.
Okay, do you want me to combine the coastal drainage side also?
Well, here, let me move stuff around here. I think everything else, so Patty Creek, Turbots Creek, I mean, those, I don't see a difference in the coloration. So those two look like they're
in the same sub watershed.
right.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, the area right at the mouth of the river, I mean, that doesn't really drain to the river per se. I guess if we're getting technical, that's purely coastal, I would think.
This down here.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's part of the coastal too. I mean, I can simplify the map and just include the coastal drainage in one shade, and then the Kennebunk River drainage in another shade, instead of including sub watersheds, if that might be easier to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other. I think that's, I don't know if how anybody else on the committee feels about that, but the only thought that I had was that the pink and the green should be combined, just because I don't know what else you would label that as. They both go into the Kennebunk River. the other ones are all clearly coastal. I think having Patty's Creek, Turbots Creek, that all makes sense. And then we can work together to figure out, some of the bats and river stuff.
Warren, isn't the pink area, isn't that where the old mill was?
Yes. So I mean, it's possible that gets called out as the mill pond, which isn't really a pond. It's tidal, so it ties into the Kennebunk River. But yeah, you're correct. I mean, that's that area there would drain into what's known as the mill pond.
Well, I can certainly simplify the drainage areas and leave the labels for the rivers and streams in there. And that will clean the map up a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay, and then I'll coordinate with you to make sure I have the correct or the most accurate surface water layer that we can get to
Okay.
figure out, where this disconnect is.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, thanks.
And Liz,
Yes.
in the discussion of the Kennebunk River, there's a discussion of certain studies that are ongoing or have been done there. I think we should reference, they're not as comprehensive, and they've been associated with the Healthy Beaches state program, but the bats at both, there's 20 years worth of data collection in the Batson and in the Little River and in points in between, mostly looking for bacteria.
Okay, and I think you sent us that data too, I believe.
Perhaps.
You sent us a couple different studies that I didn't get into because they would fall in the marine resources chapter, but I can certainly reference that data collection. And the other studies that I've mentioned in a couple of the other studies in the chapter itself are studies that were called out in the current comprehensive plan. And I looked at them a little bit, and I decided not to pull out too much information from those past studies. A couple of them are pretty old, but they are mentioned in the current comprehensive plan. All right. So one of the things that the state of Maine does with building off of some of the national wetlands inventory data is establish a set of different criteria that evaluates wetlands by, and created a few pie charts to show the percent of wetlands within Kennebunkport that meet the criteria for these 6 different categories. So anything in the teal color shows, for example, 73% of wetlands in Kennebunkport meet the criteria for providing plant and animal habitat. 36% of wetlands in town provide flood flow alteration. 22% provide finfish habitat, 18% provide sediment retention, 12% provide shellfish habitat, and 4% provide what they call a cultural value. And I looked at, excuse me, let me just move this screen over, where these different types of wetland functions are provided by different wetlands. And so all of these colored areas show the different wetlands throughout Kennebunkport, and they're colored based on the number of functions that they provide. So for example, the bright green shows wetlands that provide just one of the wetland functions, whereas the magenta color shows wetlands that provide 5 out of those 6 different wetland functions. So one of the takeaways from this is that there's very few, roughly about 60 acres of wetlands within Kennebunkport that provide 5 out of the 6 criteria. Those might be some of the more valuable wetlands to protect. So I thought that was kind of interesting data that the state has. This map is in draft form right now. I'm waiting for some confirmation from the state on some of the drinking water well data and sources. There was a little bit of conflicting information between some of the state data that I was able to obtain. But what I did was take a map from I'm forgetting the name of the water district. We're through here.
You've got the Kennebunkport Wells Water District.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. The KKWWD Water District, and I added it to a map. So they show their service area in this yellow color. I added it to a map of Kennebunkport, and then included the data available for domestic wells in the black dots, and the public well data, which again is up in the air right now. And then I also added on the aquifers, and you can see there are very few areas of aquifers that serve as a decent drinking water source, providing 10 to 50 gallons per minute in Kennebunkport. And those are located up here. On the northern side of the town, one of the portions of the aquifer is located primarily across the town line in Biddeford, and it's protected by they do have an aquifer protection overlay district. So that portion of the aquifer is protected. The town of Kennebunkport does not have an aquifer protection overlay district, but it also has very few areas of high transmissivity aquifer. So
I have a question on this one. The water district service area, was that a layer that did that come from the water district?
This is one of their maps that I georeferenced onto a GIS map. So it is from them. It's not a specific GIS layer.
Okay. It shows that there's a lot of areas. There's a lot of areas there that don't have water mains. There's a lot of land area there that that isn't serviced by by the water district. So I was just wondering. Yeah.
We do have the data layer I believe, for the water mains. So I can look at that and add that on. I can also, I've been in touch with someone at the water district to get some of this data, and I can double check and make sure that this is still the most accurate depiction of their service area. I think that they do serve about 40% of parcels in town, according to the data that I was able to find. Does that sound accurate to you?
Yeah, I think that's probably, accurate, just, because they service, the areas, the most densely populated areas in town. Yeah, so you'll want to touch base with Justin Richardson, is who your contact would be at the water district for GIS data.
Okay.
Yeah, and if not, we can we can talk through some of that as well. Yeah, because we've got the hydrant, we have hydrant locations. We should have main locations. And to some level, I want to say we have that also in the assessing data as well, whether or not a property is serviced by public utilities.
I believe we have included that data on a couple other maps. Sure, I can double check. I did not reach out to Justin for this data, but I will check in with him and see if he can provide some additional information about the extent of this map. It was a regional map. You can see it extends beyond the town boundaries a little bit, so it may be more of an estimate. It may also follow parcel lines a little bit, and so it might look like it extends farther from the road setbacks than there's actually structures. I did get some data from the water district on their annual water production, which has been fairly constant for the last 5 years or so, and the portion that is provided to Kennebunkport, which has increased increased a bit between 2018 and 2019. Another component of this chapter is looking at the floodplains. So I wanted to try to look at, I know we've talked briefly in some past meetings about the preliminary floodplain maps and some of the differences between the current and the potential future floodplain maps. And so what I've done in this map is show in blue. So if you look at the blue and green areas, that's showing you the current, and then the green areas show current and preliminary. So green areas are not proposed to change from the current floodplain, and I've just shown the extent of the 100-year floodplain or the special flood hazard area. So green areas would not be changing between what the current floodplain map is and the preliminary, and the yellow areas show some of the newer areas that will be mapped into the new floodplain. And then the blue areas show some of the areas that are actually getting mapped out of the FEMA floodplain. And some of the new maps will include some new coastal flood hazard analysis. They're based on better data and more current precipitation data. And they'll also show some non-regulatory flood risk products, such as maps that show the depth of flooding within the 100-year floodplain. And there'll be some changes to the zone designations, so the different zones within the 100-year floodplain. So I reached out to the state and got some data on the current policyholders that have flood insurance through the NFIP, and there are about 373 policyholders. The total coverage of, of these policies is about 112 million. There have been a total of 159 claims in town, which sounds like a lot, but then when you look at when the town joined the National Flood Insurance Program in 1975. That's an average about 3.5 claims and $52,000 in claims per year. There are 7 properties that are what are called repetitive loss properties, or properties that have experienced multiple claims. And there's 2 that have experienced, that are called severe repetitive loss properties. And these have experienced a total of 15 combined losses, which is quite a few for just 2 properties alone. And one thing to note is that not all property owners that are located within a flood vulnerable area are going to have flood insurance. It's required for properties who hold a mortgage, property owners who hold a mortgage, but not necessarily but those who don't. So there's quite a few properties that are not necessarily protected through this program.
The properties that have had the repeats, do we know where they are?
Usually that we won't be able to probably get the data probably for any of them. I've seen it in other communities. I mean, Werner may have access to that data, but usually it's not provided publicly because there aren't enough property owners to really show the data without pinpointing individual properties. So I've seen kind of like polygons that show this is the general area where severe repetitive loss has occurred in the community, but I haven't seen the pinpointed data on individual homeowners.
Yeah, so I just recently pulled down some of the some of the FEMA data for the for repetitive losses, and I want to say mine had some different numbers to it, but let me go back through it and I'll share what I have with you.
Okay.
It takes some digging to find it, and to kind of tease it out, but it's there.
Okay. I didn't do a lot of digging. I just asked for the data from the state.
Yeah.
So we can compare.
Yeah, right. We'll compare our data. We'll compare the data and see what's
Try to figure out what's going on.
Right. See where it actually lands. Just a couple of comments on this. Depending on the time frame of when we, whenever we put forward, the comprehensive plan, I don't want to jinx us, but we may actually have updated regulatory maps at that point. So, I think the question is then, do we, there might be some labeling change here. I do think it's important to kind of spell out maybe the differences between, because it will have been a very recent change, to be able to say, all right, here's what the, the 83 and 88 maps had for areas, and here's what it went to in, and what I'm going to say is, 2021. Just to give some comparison between, the amount of land area that, is, how much more land area is being designated as floodplain areas as opposed to what it's previously been. So I think that would be interesting probably to highlight in this version of the comp plan.
Sure.
The other thing that may be helpful for folks to just, in terms of context, and I think, you said, Liz, that, this sounds like a lot of claims, but in the grand scheme of the history of the program, it really isn't. And so I don't know exactly where it might fit, but it would be, interesting to put in maybe 1 or 2 other communities just as a comparison, because I think folks can visually sort of understand like, oh, the town of Kennebunk is developed in this fashion, or the town of Wells is developed in this fashion, just to see, the differences, because I think, well, I know what we'll see is we'll see some dramatic differences in flood losses, in repetitive, and not only in repetitive losses, but just in kind of dollar amount claims.
Werner, I was wondering if you know what parts of town are seeing the repetitive losses.
That's a good, well, I can tell you where I've seen damage that I think that happens on a repetitive basis. I've seen it, I've seen it in the Kennebunk River is where I've seen it, I've seen, some, and it's not, I wouldn't classify it as significant damage, because, whenever you look at, this number here, 52,000 in claims per year, spread out at over 3.5 claims that's not a lot of money, so most of what you're dealing with there is, say drywall, that's going to be drywall damage, insulation, drywall damage. But it's been along Ocean Avenue. It's been in some of the businesses in Dock Square, that we've seen, kind of that, what I would call maybe some nuisance damage, that's on a repetitive case. Now, I have seen damage, more significant damage, that's occurred, for instance, along, the Marshall Point area. We've had, where we had a couple of where we had some significant nor'easters. There's been what I would say more significant damage along that area. And those are areas that are, you've got properties that are classified within velocity zones there. And it makes sense. I mean, there's definitely been some V zone action that, along the Marshall's Point and Skipper Joe's areas. We've seen, again, to a lesser extent, there's been, some, what I would classify more into the minor damage, from flooding, in the Goose Rocks area. I mean, we haven't seen necessarily, in recent years, what I would say were complete losses. Most of it, thankfully has been what I would say is probably a minor damages.
I can ask the person I was in touch with at the state too to see if they can give us some sort of anecdotal information about where some of the repetitive losses have occurred.
Yeah.
I just don't think that they'll give out that data for privacy reasons.
Yeah, let me, well, as you're talking through here, I'll see if I can dig up some of what I have here.
Sure. And I like the idea of putting the land area in too. And I intended to, and I apparently forgot to do that. The only thing is that some of the current floodplain data doesn't show any map amendments. So there may be some small areas that, are not captured by the current GIS data, at least, or the current floodplain.
Right.
And I included just some general information about the number of structures at risk of flooding in Maine. And I think it would be interesting to supplement this with a comparison of some of the claims from maybe Wells and Kennebunkport, Kennebunk, or a couple other communities in the area. I like that idea. I did find that the average annual flood insurance policy premium in Maine is about $960. So for those of you who might have a flood insurance policy, you can compare your policy to that average number. And there's about 9,000 flood insurance policies in effect in Maine.
If I could jump in for a second, Liz, one
Mhm.
about this map that I'm struck by is the amount of yellow that's depicted at Goose Rocks Beach. It's quite a large extent of yellow.
Mm-hmm.
And, there may be some homeowners down there that are, may have to think about the, whether or not they should obtain flood insurance.
Yeah, and one thing I should add, just to clarify that when I was mapping this out, I clipped the extent of the floodplain to the land area boundary. So the floodplain does actually extend out into some of the tidal areas a bit, but because those are tidal areas and not developed, I thought it was more clear to show the floodplain only on sort of the land area side. But the actual floodplain does extend out a little bit, and it extends around some of the islands as well. So the next map that I have added in here shows the preliminary floodplain in yellow, along with a couple of the sea level rise and storm surge scenarios that we have for this area. And I've included the lowest scenario of 1.2 feet over the highest astronomical tide, and then also 10.9 feet. So the dark blue areas show the mean high water. The yellow, as I mentioned, shows the preliminary floodplain. And then these lighter blue areas show the 1.2 foot scenario. And then if you look out beyond that at some of the green, that's the extent of a 10.9 foot sea level rise scenario. So one of the take homes from this map that I see is that if the town only experiences about 1.2 feet of sea level rise, most of the area that's already included within your preliminary floodplain, so areas that are identified as vulnerable to flooding, fall within those boundaries. So there's not a lot of light blue that extends further inland than the yellow, but you can see that a lot of the green areas do. So as the sea level rise scenario increases, the area that's vulnerable to this flooding is exceeding the area that's covered by the 100-year floodplain. So there's a lot more land area that's potentially vulnerable to flooding in the future that is not really identified as vulnerable land now. And obviously there's quite a few different scenarios in between the 1.2 and the 10.9 scenarios here, but I just wanted to show those to kind of bracket the difference there. Does anyone have any questions about that map? Is that clearly displayed? Okay. So another element of the chapter is a discussion of water quality. I've just included a couple highlights here. Statewide, there's actually a fish consumption advisory for all fresh waters for mercury. The non-tidal portion of the Kennebunk River is rated as Class B. And below the head of the tide is a similar class called Class SB. And Class B waters have fewer restrictions than Class A, but they still maintain high water quality. The primary sources of impacts to the Kennebunk River are development, recreational use, and agriculture. And the river is listed as impaired for bacteria. So when the water quality is classified that's based on designated uses for the particular water body, which include, as I've listed over on the side here, drinking water supply, recreation, habitat for fish and other aquatic life, water quality criteria, including bacteria, dissolved oxygen, and biological criteria, and anti-degradation criteria. And so if it's impaired for bacteria, it's essentially not meeting the standard, which isn't uncommon. Some of the threats to freshwater resources, non-point source pollution, and that is a broad category of pollution that is generated from stormwater runoff, septic systems, underground storage tanks, and essentially runoff that reaches water bodies either over the surface or through aquifers, as opposed to point source pollution, which is a direct discharge. So like a pipe that's directly, that has an outlet directly into a water source. The only point source pollution discharge that I was able to find information on is the wastewater treatment discharge into the Kennebunk River. However, this is treated water, and so it's unlikely to actually be a significant source of pollution. I looked at some of the aquatic invasive species data that is available for Maine, and there's actually very little risk and very little current presence of invasive species documented in water bodies in Kennebunkport, which was great. Beaver Pond was identified as being at moderate risk of infestation from aquatic plants. A couple other potential threats to water resources include dams and culverts. The Turbats Creek and Batson River Dam were identified as potential barriers to fish movement. There's about 60 culverts on these. Let me just double check my notes here. 60 culverts, of which about 92% were identified as barriers or potential barriers to fish movement. And then climate change, which we've mentioned some of the potential climate change impacts, including changes in precipitation, increased temperature. These can have an impact on surface water bodies as well, and sea level rise induced groundwater rise, which can occur up to 3 or 5 miles inland from coastal areas, based on what we've learned from some local studies in New Hampshire. And when we have our guest speaker, Jay Knott, present, she'll be talking more about sea level rise induced groundwater rise and some of the threats that has to drinking water wells and potential septic system, increasing pollution associated with septic systems that are subject to higher groundwater levels.
Liz, before we leave this slide, I have a question for the committee. Concerns the aquatic barriers. Has this been an issue that's been discussed in town? I'm trying to get a sense of the community, if it's off the radar screen or if it is on the radar screen. What are people saying?
I was wondering the same thing. I don't know where the Turbats Creek Dam is, but I was wondering about the history of the one in the Batson, why it exists. Does anyone know the history?
I don't. Yeah, I mean, from what I understand, I mean, some of those dams are, I mean, they're old remnants of, of that era and age whenever you had, whenever water power was being used primarily for mills. I believe the one on the Batson was for, was for a mill. Liz, is there, do you know, is there a resource at DEP that lists as far as dam owners, and maybe license numbers? I seem to recall that dams had to be checked, had to be inspected and licensed every so many years.
I'll check DEP. I did just get the transportation data set, which
Yeah.
which does have culverts and bridges. Don't know if it had dams, but I will check on that. And I should clarify that the 60 culverts are within the Kennebunk River watershed. They're not all within Kennebunkport.
Yeah.
But I'll check on the license numbers. Is that something that you'd like included in the chapter? Like
Well,
a listing of
when
those?
when I'm thinking of dams, I'm thinking of, can only really kind of quickly only 2 or 3 come to mind. I mean, I think it's, if we've got an inventory, it's important to maybe call out which, where those dams are, where the dams are located.
Mhm. So I think there's just 2. The Turbets Creek Dam, which is near Oakwood Drive on Batson River, Goosefair Bay, and I think the number for it, I'm not sure if this is the license number, but it's D5045. And then the Batson River Dam, which was built in 1990. I don't have the year that the Turbets Creek Dam was built. But I'll see
All right.
what other data I can pull from the GIS database on those 2 dams.
Tom, to answer your question, I don't think there's been much discussion in Kennebunkport about these 2. There was a huge battle over one that went on for several years in Kennebunk.
Right.
It was involving power generation and licensing, and I don't even know where it ended up. But a lot of people wanted it, wanted it not to be licensed and let the river flow, and other people wanted to maintain, I guess, a river in their backyard all the time. And where do you live in that town? What happened?
Yeah, no, that's a good, that most of that controversy surrounded whether or not, the water, whether Kennebunk Light and Power was also going to be getting their license renewed. So it's the dam that's on, it's on the Mousom River. And a lot of the controversy was coming up whether or not the license was going to be renewed for, it's still a functional kind of hydro power dam. And I don't recall that they've hit the point yet where that license has been renewed. From what I understand, it wasn't necessarily a high functioning location,
I don't think they wanted to spend the money to keep it going.
That's right. Yeah, I think there were some there were economic considerations as to whether or not it was worth it to keep it, to keep it functioning. But Paul's correct in the sense that, there was a lot of, there's a lot of kind of contentious debate about, whether or not to, whether to keep it, whether to take it down. And, and, what the effects of that, would be, both, upstream of the location, relative to, people's property values, and then certainly the habitat considerations were also, something that was discussed. So I don't recall that there's been a definitive, that there's a definitive and final plan with it, except that I didn't get the impression that that Light and Power was really actively pursuing maintaining that license.
Yeah, I asked the question because it's been my experience that when there's a proposal to remove a dam, it generally provokes a pretty strong reaction throughout the community, and opinion is quite divided. So, as Liz and I are preparing the plan here, I was just thinking to myself, well, do we let this sleeping dog lay, or does this committee want to, take a position on the dams?
I mean,
Yeah,
I would say it's worth describing it, and, is there habitat, would we have different fish, could salmon go up the, either of these? What would be the difference if you removed it?
It would be very beneficial to certain species of fish, not salmon, but others. This I've garnered from some reading of them from the state. But I don't want to generate controversy if we're not.
Yeah.
Gonna...
I mean, my sense is that it's it's not been an issue because nobody's made it an issue, right? I think that, I see I see two sides of the coin, with that particular dam. One, I think you would have a large segment of the population that recognizes, I would say the cultural value of that dam, with the pond, with the ponding that's on the other side. I mean, you drive by there during the summer and I mean, you've always got a bunch of kids, jumping off the bridge,
Which one are you talking about?
The
Batson River?
The Batson River one on Route 9. So I suspect that as a, as a swimming hole has a lot of, emotional, there's a lot of emotional and value, to the community. And
Talk me out of it, Werner. We're not going to touch that third rail.
yeah, I think that's probably smart.
According to the transportation data set that I was just looking at today, there are maybe about 5 bridges in the transportation data set, and I think only 3 culverts within Kennebunkport, within the data set that we have from the state. So there aren't actually too many culverts within Kennebunkport, which is something I can add into this chapter also, even though there are quite a few in the watershed, which has a larger impact, I would say, on the overall water quality in the watershed, because Kennebunkport doesn't really account for much of the watershed itself. But there are apparently very few culverts within Kennebunkport. Does that sound like a reasonable estimate to you? Okay. All right, so just a couple more slides to go through here. The chapter.
One thing real quick, Liz, just on that piece of it, what I suspect that, isn't accurately depicted, and I don't really have a data source for this, is going to be, significant culverts and bridges that are on private roads. I mean, we've got a large network of private roads in town, and I know a fair number of them have significant culverts, and, maybe even some old bridges, on them that are probably not, picked up in any inventory. And short of just flat out driving around all of them and counting them, I don't know exactly where, how else you would pick up that data.
Yeah, I drive over 3 every day. I was on mute, so that's why you couldn't ask my question. Was that, are the culverts, is that off of the state roads in town? Because that might be
I think it's
versus
state and town roads, but I'll double
in town
check
roads?
that. Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, because we have, there's one right on Beechwood. And then for the Tyler Brook.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. I can pull up the table that I actually just pulled together today if you're interested in the streets, but I think there were only three culverts and a handful of bridges, and I'm pretty sure that it's state and
State and
local
regular
roads,
roads?
but I'll have
Okay.
to double check that.
Okay.
So some of the existing measures in place to protect water resources include the zoning, shoreline and resource protection districts. Some of the regulations for development, including the stormwater management regulations, regulation of development in the floodplain contained in the floodplain ordinance. The preventing discharge of potential contaminants into water bodies associated with development, different land conservation activities and areas. I know that there are a couple areas where there's conserved land surrounding water resources within Kennebunkport. And then I had a couple questions based on some of the information that Chapter 208 addresses as far as information contained in the comprehensive plan. And one of those is, Werner, you may be aware of this or may have to follow up with Public Works, but do Public Works crews and contractors use best management practices to protect water resources in their daily operations? So do you know if there's any like green salt application practices or like erosion and sedimentation control measures that that Public Works may employ during construction activities or snow plowing, road maintenance?
Yes, I mean, I know they use best management practices for, for projects that they have when they're adjacent to water bodies. But I think, probably having that conversation with Mike Claus from Public Works, he can probably give you some of the more specifics in terms of, what exactly they do, relative to, for their, how they deal with, with potential contaminants.
Okay.
We've got the nicest salt shed in the county.
That's right. We've got a nice salt shed, and we don't dump any of the snow in the river anymore. So.
And you're freezing up again.
When did the town dump salt in the river or snow in the river?
I mean, that was an age-old practice that,
Yeah.
That I think DEP put a stop to that years ago. But as far as I know, the town's been, the town has a location where, all their snow gets stockpiled. They've been doing that in that location. I'm gonna say since at least the 90s, if not before then. So. But that used to be the practice, in many communities, in Maine, they used to just, dump it in the river. But that hasn't been the practice for a long time.
Okay, I can definitely reach out to Mike and and get some details to include in the chapter. Are there any other protection measures that anyone is aware of that that you'd like to highlight in this chapter, as far as sort of activities or active measures to protect water quality, or different programs that we may not be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what else specifically we would throw into, those other protection measures.
What about the contractor certification for erosion control for land use permits? And
Yep.
DEP permits?
Yeah, no, that's a good one, Mike. Mike Corsi was breaking up a little bit, but one of the things that that we take care of to watch over is that when the town issues any land use permits, for construction activities within the shoreland zone, we check to make sure that the contractors who are doing the work have their DEP certifications to be able to to do soil disturbance and earth moving within the shoreland zone.
One thing that's been concerning to me as construction materials have changed in recent years is the amount of, when you see a construction site, the amount of plastic wood that is used, and we don't seem to have any, it was one thing when sawdust flew all over the place, nobody really thought anything about it. But now we have an extraordinary amount of plastic from trim work and from siding and from, indoor, mostly exterior, that flies all over the place, that is not really being at all diverted from just, the rainwater from it getting washed off the site. It's done in driveways, it's done on grassy areas, it's done, today I saw a guy with his saw, circular saw, doing insulation panels. This was a contractor, not just a home hacker like me. But out there on the lawn, and the stuff is blowing all over the place, the foam. But I think the plastic, that's more unusual to see, but the plastic without any barrier around it and any guidance on how you're supposed to cut it, and should you, vacuum it up or sweep it up and keep it in a protected area. It's just going all over the place.
Yeah. That's a good point. I can look around and see if there's any kind of best management practices that we could point
10 years
to.
ago, it didn't exist. 15 years ago, it didn't exist.
Right.
On the scale.
Any other items?
Should we include anything on our subdivision regs, Werner? And how we deal with water quality? Or not?
Yeah,
Is that
I mean,
it's too specific.
well, no, I mean, I think it's fine. We can, I can pull together some of the language that's in the subregs, Liz, if you want to make reference to the specifics for stormwater, out of the town subdivision regs.
Sure. I did kind of poke through the subdivision, I think, and
Yeah, it's in there.
but I'll double check and make sure, and I can expand on that discussion too, for sure.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that the state does require is a reference to, current regulations and existing protection measures. And obviously they don't want us to copy and paste the entire regulation, but
No,
a
but
summary and a reference should be in there.
yeah, I think they're probably looking for the reference to the specific standard. It would be my guess. Yeah, I'm assuming they don't want you to just say that, stormwater management is regulated via the subdivision regs, or a site plan process, but. Yeah, I'm guessing they want to know what the specific standard is.
I would love to have a discussion about this topic at some point, particularly when the, flood map changes and millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars of property is going to be affected by what comes downstream, particularly if it's the wrong tide. And when I lived in Jersey, things had gotten so bad because of so much development that you had to keep all of the water on site. We have regulations which say, to the extent practicable or something like that. But in Jersey now, town by town by town, after all the flooding and all the expense, if people put on an addition on the back of the house, they have to find a way to keep that water on site. It's no longer just going down to the next town. And while we're coastal and it's just going out to the ocean, but when it backs up and then it comes out, it's going to have a I would think, I'm no expert, but I would think it's going to have a increasingly negative impact upon the folks, the older development. I'm thinking of Goose Rocks primarily, which is what I know best. If you get the wrong tide and you then get all this water adding to it, you're just going to wipe neighborhoods out. And if it could be mitigated, it should be.
You can probably add in like a little bit of discussion in the freshwater resources and then also in marine resources chapter to kind of tackle the impacts of upstream development, but then also I think you're referencing like tidal flooding also.
Well, it's
combination of the two.
Combination.
Yeah.
Yeah. If
Sure.
you put in 30 houses, that's displacing a lot of what used to be vernal pools and area that accepted water and no longer can.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
while there is mitigation ponds and things that are put up there, it's not the same as saying keep it on site. You build $1 million house, find a way to spend a little more and keep the water on site.
Yeah.
Werner, do you have a view on that? You know a lot more about this than me.
Yeah, so most of your stormwater regs, today will tell you that, pre-development and post-development rates, need to be the same. So in other words, whatever's documented in terms of, and this is primarily what you're dealing with in a subdivision development, is that it pre and post is supposed to be the same. What I do think winds up changing to some degree is the rate, and the speed in which you see stormwater exit a site. So it's not that stormwater, that there's an increase per se, but in the sense that whenever you have increases in impervious surface area, it increases the speed at which it exits a site. Unless you've done adequate retention and detention to do your treatment to slow it down. But ultimately, I mean, that's and I think that's one of those things that you see in development. You take a site and your standard stormwater practices usually wind up with more point specific discharges than previously what you had before. Standard practices are typically going to go to a point discharge as opposed to pre-development what might have just been sheet flow that came off of a site.
Well, most of the keep it on site regulations I've seen were primarily intended to help the aquifer recharge. People were saying, look, our groundwater is depleting, and here we are sending water out to the ocean. What's going on with that? So that could have been some about what was going on in Jersey as well.
No, it was totally, in the county that I lived in, there were 5 towns that got wiped out repeatedly from upstream development. 40 years ago, there was nothing there. And then it became part of
Right.
suburbs, and all of a sudden, the flooding downstream in these little rivers that wound through towns, were so bad that regionally or statewide they started to, do it. It had nothing to do with groundwater retention.
There's 2 good reasons to consider that.
Yeah. Yeah, just looking quickly at our subdivision regs, it sort of focuses on the peak discharge rates, as Werner was referring to, and keeping them to pre-development levels based on 2-year, 10-year, 25-year frequencies of a 24-hour storm. And no reference to the replenishment of the aquifer. We only have one little aquifer in our town, so.
Yeah, it's probably not applicable to Kennebunkport.
Yeah, quite
Right.
applicable here.
First.
But with storms becoming more intense and more rainfall in periods of time, things are changing.
Yeah.
And how much water. And, we've gotten very lucky, Werner, you certainly know that, severe storms in the past 3, 4, 5 years, if the tide had been a little different, all that water coming down would have, made a huge difference.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think we've definitely recognized that, it's been, had the chips fallen a little bit differently, in terms of, the timing of tides and the storm events and things like that. Things could have been a lot worse, and I think at some point, we're gonna, we're not gonna be so lucky anymore that, that the stars aren't always, aren't gonna align where, where we don't have all of those issues coming together all at once, an astronomical high, one of those slow nor'easters that just sits off the coast and just repeatedly pushes and pushes and pushes and dumps, and dumps rain inland. It's those types of events that eventually, are gonna cause some significant damage. So I did, Liz, while we were talking, I dug through, and I can send you, I'll send you this the Excel sheet with the repetitive loss properties. So I found 2 properties. It doesn't give me any, an address location or anything like that. It does indicate that both of them were both non-residential properties, and it looks like they were both in A zones. One was an AE, one was an AO2. So yeah, I can send you, I can send you that whole spreadsheet, that I've got. It's it's the national one, so it's, you're definitely going to want to cut out, just focus primarily on Kennebunkport's data. There are multiple dates for damages in there, which is what leads me to believe these are, this is why it got classified as repetitive loss, because there's multiple dates in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'll just send you the whole thing.
Okay, yeah, I'll take a look at it, and if there are some differences between what the state provided, then I'll just reach out and ask for some clarification on that, and I can copy you on that email too.
Yep, nope,
And
sounds good.
as far as the existing protection measures for some of the, I'll add in some more detail from the land use ordinance and the subdivision regulations, and then that will give us a little more to go off on when we talk about some potential recommendations, that may include the precipitation data that's used when evaluating the stormwater design, and what the design standards are. And then we'll have a little bit more to go off of when we're thinking about potential improvements. And
Yeah, and I don't think that anybody's opposed to hearing about, once you look at the standards there, if there's any, suggestions in terms of updates, for either one of those,
Yeah.
I don't think that that's, I think we're amenable to hearing, about, the differences between, the standards that we have versus what's been updated,
Sure.
I know it's been a while since those standards have been updated, and I've got to believe that we've got some better standards out there that we could be looking at.
Great. Yeah, I can definitely include some general items that then we can kind of discuss further when we're digging into the recommendations and strategies. Other than that, I have just a map of your shoreline zoning, which is included in the chapter, and all of the different sub areas. I must say, we do not have anything like this in New Hampshire. And I'm not sure if that's good or bad, to be honest. The state requirements that we've been going over for each of the chapters, I'll just go over these pretty quickly. As far as what the state would like to see in each of the chapters, the state goal to protect the water quality and manage the quantity of the state's water resources, including lakes, aquifers, great ponds, estuaries, rivers, and coastal areas. Policies include protecting current and potential drinking water sources, protecting significant surface water resources from pollution, improving water quality where needed, protecting water resources in growth areas, minimizing pollution discharges through the upgrade of existing public sewer systems and wastewater treatment facilities, and cooperating with neighboring communities and regional local advocacy groups to protect water resources. Some of the analyses include the water resources data set, which we received and have incorporated. A lot of the GIS data is provided through this data set. Description of each great pond, river, surface water, drinking water supply, and other water bodies of local interest, including the ecological value, threats to water quality or quantity, and documented water quality or invasive species problems. One thing that we could add in was, Werner, what was the, is there a name of the body of water that you were referring to that the kids swim in with it next to the dam?
I mean, I think it's just the Batson River.
Just the
Yeah.
Batson River?
Yeah.
Because that is potentially something that could be noted as good cultural recreational value, since there aren't very many freshwater, swimmable freshwater areas. Also make a note about that. Past and present activities to monitor, assess, and or improve water quality, mitigate pollution, or control the prevent the spread of invasive species. I did include a little bit of water quality data that I didn't get into tonight on flow for water bodies that I could find that data on. I think, as Paul mentioned, it seems like most of the monitoring and data collection is collected for some of the coastal areas and marine resources and not as much on the freshwater side of things, at least from what I could find. But then again, there are also there's very little indication that there's any significant aquatic invasive species concerns in the town. A description of the location and nature of significant threats to aquifer drinking water supplies. There are very few drinking water supplies, aquifer supplies in the town to begin with. I did note that the Biddeford has aquifer protection overlay district, which would theoretically protect the land above the aquifer on that side of the municipal boundary. A summary of existing lake, pond, river, stream, drinking water protection and preservation measures, including local ordinances. And that's it.
Okay.
So let me stop sharing for now so everyone can see everyone again. And happy to answer questions or have additional discussion on items that you'd like to see in here that you feel may not be sufficiently covered or other areas of interest.
What about saltwater as a threat to the wells? Is that an appropriate place to include that? I know the firehouse lost their fresh water and had to dig deeper. What did they used to have a dug well before, Werner? Do you know? The Goose Rocks Fire Station, which is 3/4 of a mile from the beach.
Yeah, that's a good question, Paul. I don't know what they had there before. I do know, I think that they got a new well out there, but I don't know what they had there previously.
Yeah, I don't either.
But it was a saltwater problem, not, like I know people in town this summer who lost their wells, their dug wells and had to dig deeper because of the drought. But
Can see if I can get some actual data on that from maybe DEP. Might have that. I did mention the concern of sea level induced groundwater rise and the impacts to wells, but I don't have that specific detail. Which was that well that you mentioned first?
the Goose Rocks firehouse,
Okay.
which,
Up by Route 9, isn't it, Paul?
yeah, it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Straight off of Route 9.
And there are a lot of wells. What surprised me is there's a lot of wells between there and the ocean. All those.
Yeah.
Werner, I was looking at that map. Do you know all the neighborhoods, that aren't on sewer back there? Do most of them have? It showed a lot of wells back there on the map that Liz had.
Right?
If they're serviced by primarily wells, all those streets, those private streets?
Well, some of those areas, you get this mix of where, the water district might have seasonal water service. And so, as properties have converted over to year-round use, you wind up with this mix of both, like they might still have a seasonal water main for summer water, but if they're there year-round, then they'll utilize a well. So back in the, in the Prescott area, you've got, you have a little bit of that phenomenon back there where you've got, where you have folks that have put in wells.
Was that because when they put the line in from the main to the home, they dug it seasonally? And because I know that's happened around here, I've seen people have to dig it deeper But
Yeah.
you're saying the whole neighborhood didn't have it deep enough.
That's right. Yeah, in some cases in some cases it's the main itself, isn't deep enough.
Got it.
Not just the individual services. There are some other areas, some neighborhoods off of Ocean Avenue that I know that have had really poor water quality in terms of well water. That's prompted main extensions. In particular, I know that the Seaview neighborhood, has, historically there has had has had poor water quality. Both a combination, I think, of salt water as well as just, extremely low flow.
Thanks.
But my understanding, that isn't anything necessarily new. That's that's been that way for quite some time.
Is there a demand for increased drinking water service in town that you're aware of?
I would say that, just generally anecdotally, I would say yes. It's not uncommon for me to hear stories about folks who are out, who have well water that have to, that spend a significant amount of money, to do treatment, for their well water, that it's just not, it's just not necessary. It's not necessarily great quality well water. That we have in town. So, would I say there's a demand? I would say sure. Folks I think wouldn't be upset at having access to town water. I think, since the water district is a separate entity, it's not something that's driven by, the town's infrastructure projects per se. So it's not something that shows up in a capital improvement budget that says, all right, we're gonna extend water, X number of feet down such and such road. The water district being a separate entity, they run their own capital projects. But I think a lot of it is, one, is based on demand, and two, we've seen them in town, spending a good amount of resources just upgrading and replacing, aging infrastructure. We just had a main extension that was replaced, running down Wilds District and on South Main Street. That was pretty old. Just recently got replaced. So they're pretty active in the communities that they service in terms of keeping up their infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Any other items? Thanks for all the feedback. I've got quite a few notes here, so I can incorporate some changes and track down some additional data and revise draft 1.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So next, number 3, which I try to make number 1, which was the review of minutes of October. Did you guys do that while I was off air? Or
No.
not?
No.
No, okay. So take a motion on the minutes.
So moved.
There a second?
I second.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Say aye.
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 Janet, nice
All
job.
right. All right, sounds like 5. Yeah, thank you. Nice job.
Thank you.
At some point, we'll have to get around to formally voting. Maybe we'll do that next time. Any other business? I skipped over next steps. Next step, so reviewing the marine resource chapter.
We'll have a draft to you in about a week's time.
Okay. That'll be good. Any other topics?
Scheduling. What are your scheduling plans for the holiday season?
Yeah,
question.
so looking forward, if we're sticking with our first and third schedule, so that would put us at December 1st, would be the next meeting on that schedule. And then, if we're going to do 2 meetings in December, then the 15th would be the second meeting of December.
So I guess my question is it your preference to do 2 meetings in December?
I'm game. I'd like to make up for the one we missed in November. But rest of the
Yeah,
board, or
No problem with it.
That works for me.
take. All right. Yeah, so let's do 1st and 15th.
Okay.
We'll plan on it.
I'm going to try to be here for the next meeting, but I'm due in about a week and a half, so I may not be present. But
Okay.
I'll be with you all in spirit.
Don't have to worry about that. We'll be with you in
Right.
spirit.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Hope
I'm
all
hoping it
goes well.
arrives soon.
Yes. All right. All right, I need one more motion and a second. Jim?
Hearing no
Six.
other activity at the meeting, I propose that we adjourn the meeting.
I second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. All right. Thank you all.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.